Good to see you. I'm very happy to be back at AgileByExample. I'd like to talk a little bit about this concept of growing adaptive organizations, and I'll tell you more. I have just to be explicit about one thing. I will not stay much longer after the talk. Unfortunately, I have a flight to catch in the afternoon. So just grab me if you want to have a conversation after the talk before I leave later, or just contact me on social media. LinkedIn is my preferred social media. Anyway, let's move on. During introduction, somebody Tomasz told you what I do outside of this room. I have to warn you about what I do when I'm speaking at conferences. There are certain things that you should know. Number one, I tend to think about things that are usually not visible. So I tend to talk about stuff like culture, mindset, human dynamics, and stuff like that. And the reason why I like to talk about these things at conferences is because I think that what is less visible is more powerful. The things that are very visible, like your processes, like the tools that you use, whatever, all those things very visible, they're very useful, but they're not as powerful as your mindset. And so if I have only 30 minutes and try to give you something as useful as possible, I like to talk about what is usually not visible. And I also like to talk about my own personal experience. So I have a quick question for you. Would you like to spend a couple of minutes to find a partner? And if you don't find anybody because they are tired and they want to talk to you, don't worry, it's nothing personal. Okay, so this is just an opportunity. Find a partner and just try to discuss this question. In your opinion, what an agile organization is not? Okay. It's a tricky question. I'm not asking what is an agile organization. I'm asking what an agile organization is not. Would you like to try for a couple of minutes, please? Go. Thank you. So, did you make any new friend? Okay, that was the point. Okay, you did. Good for you. So I'm curious, what came out of your conversation? Do you have like a short sentence or just one word? Just yell it so I can hear it. So what an agile organization is not? Control. Control. Thank you very much for yelling so loud. Is what? Psychopathic. Sociopathic. Missing readiness for change. Yeah? Set in stone. Fear? Okay, just one more. Just fixed on processes. Okay, processes and you say extra. Oh, big processes. Okay, good. Thank you very much. Good. And of course, there is much more. Now, the title of this talk is kind of tricky because I use two words which you might not usually find in an Agile conference. Number one word is growing, which is not something that, I mean, this is not an agriculture conference, right? So why would I want to talk about growing things or growing stuff? And the other one is adaptive. Now, there is a slight difference between an adaptive organization and an agile organization. They are not necessarily the same thing, but they have something in common. Both kind of organizations, they want to be able to change easily. And so, for instance, when you talk about adaptive organizations, we use the metaphor of a chameleon, because the chameleon is a kind of animal that is, number one, constantly in contact with the surrounding environment. So, for instance, if the background becomes green, the chameleon changes the color of his skin so that it can camouflage or not, depending if the chameleon wants to mate or not, which is a different story. But anyway, so constant environmental scanning. And then if you talk about organizations, one good way of speeding up your decisional processes rather than go through a hierarchy is to decentralize decision making, which is basically empowering people, creating smaller focused groups, give them more autonomy, let that some decisions are made at the level where the information is to make the right decision, all these kind of things. And then what else? Adapting based on empirical evidence and not just on assumptions that are not validated by actual information. collaborating more efficiently, delivering value, blah, 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 blah. So that would be very nice, right? And that would be very much different from the kind of organization that you briefly discussed and described 2 minutes ago. Now, the thing is, many organizations today, actually most organizations today, still are based on a different metaphor. They're not based on the metaphor of the chameleon, they're based on the metaphor of the production machine. And that's just an echo of the Industrial Revolution. Now, the Industrial Revolution was something extremely important in the history of mankind and also extremely useful to us because virtually any good that you are using or wearing in this room today was built using industrialized processes. So much of the wealth and well-being that we can experience today in our society comes from the Industrial Revolution. However, the Industrial Revolution was focused on producing stuff, and mainly physical goods. So the metaphor behind organizations that are in the industrial mindset is the organization is a production machine, and as such, we treat people as part of the production machine, which is neither good or bad. That's not my point. The point is, that's the metaphor by which the organization is driven, okay? And of course, as you have said, this is not very adaptive. If your organization is based on control, is based on processes, is based on rigid structures, and so on, it's not very adaptive. It's very efficient, but not very effective. So just think about this. You can be efficient only when you start doing something over and over again. When you start doing something over and over again, you start finding opportunities for becoming more efficient. But if you do something just once, then it's more important to be effective, which means to hit the target, to reach the goal, rather than being efficient. You also want to be efficient, but effectiveness is more important, especially in an environment which is constantly changing. Now, I assume that most of you guys work in IT. In IT, you never do the same thing twice. Right? Nobody writes the same code twice or thrice or 4 times or 10 times. Every time you write code, and if you do, I'm sorry for you, but yeah, because it wouldn't be necessary, right? If you want to build 100 chairs, then you need to make 100 chairs. But if you want to sell 10,000 copies of your software, you just need to write it once, right? So it's a different kind of business. So number one, in IT, we do not make the same thing over and over again. We constantly learn, and therefore we need to constantly adapt to what we learn. And number two, we don't do labor work, we do intellectual work. So this kind of changing from an industrial mindset to production machine metaphor and moving into an organic, adaptive metaphor for running the organization is actually pretty tricky. And it's not a surprise that many organizations are struggling in making this transition. I don't like the word transformation. I like the word evolution or transition, but I don't like the word transformation. So the good news is that as human beings, not only we can learn, but we can only learn to change the conceptual structure of our understanding of the world. Like in this case, now I see that the background is kind of dark, but basically the background of this slide is a cosmological model back to the time when we believed that the Earth was the center of the universe and the human race was the apex of creation. And that was, a few centuries ago. And then by empirical observation and by inferring what we were observing, we realized that no, sorry, you're not the center of creation, you're just a speck of dust in an infinite nothing, and probably you're not even the apex of creation. So this realization was a shift in a conceptual structure of how we perceive the world. So the question is, can we shift our conceptual structure of how we perceive organizations? I believe we can. And in fact, I've seen many organizations doing that or being in a process of doing that. However, there is one thing that I see is preventing many organizations from moving forward, from making this kind of change. And I see the screen is dark, and there is a reason for that. I'll give you an example. Now, let's say that you are having a nice hike on the mountains somewhere, nice path, clear day, blue sky, and you're following a path, and you have reference points here and there, and then suddenly, for some reason, a very thick fog comes down, and now you cannot see anything. Now, my question is, would you proceed with the same speed and confidence as when you could see, or would you be much more careful or possibly stay still? What would you do in case you were in the fog? What? The second one, yeah. Sounds wise to me. Thank you. It was kind of a rhetorical question. And thank you for playing the game with me. So there is this concept which I like to call obfuscation, which is basically living in a state, from the organizational point of view, living in a state where you have limited information, limited feedback, and therefore it's very hard to make good decisions because you're not in a position to make good decisions. And working in organizations, I came to realize that there are a number of, let's say, patterns that I identified along the years, things that you have seen in the same way that I've seen them, okay? The only difference is that I try to give these a name. And the reason why I wanted to give these things a name is because if you give something a name, then you can start talking about it. And the moment you start talking about it, you start changing something. The moment you are not aware or you cannot label something, it just lingers there forever. So what I'd like to do is I'd like to offer a small vocabulary that you can use to have smarter conversations in your organization so that you can reduce the level of obfuscation, which means you can help the organizations to change faster. Okay? So that's my intent. So pattern number one is what I call segregation. Now, segregation is when you intentionally keep people apart. And I'll give you an example, which I'm sure you are familiar with. Has it ever happened to you that you could not contact a colleague directly by email or something? Instead, you had to contact these guys' bosses. So then, basically, you had to go up the command chain so that because you couldn't have a peer-to-peer communication. I've seen this in organizations, especially large organizations with many departments, where people at the same organizational level were deliberately not allowed to communicate directly, but they had to go up and down the command chain. Okay? Okay, you are laughing over there. Okay. Okay. Anybody else have seen this, or you have this experience? Okay, about 15% of the audience. Now, in that case, I mean, there could be very good reasons. What I'm saying is there could be reasons. Sometimes there could be some kind of privacy issues or whatever. But if you're doing this just out of habit, it's possible that you are obfuscating information and therefore you are preventing people from collaborating more smoothly and more rapidly. If you need an information and you have to wait 3 days for this flow of emails to come back to you, well, you have been wasting 3 days just waiting, right? So you're not very adaptive, you're not very fast in reacting and in moving. Second kind of obfuscation is what I like to call sectarianism. Now, segregation usually is a top-down thing, is a top-down dynamic. Segregation is imposed by the top, and they decide that people should be segregated. And sectarianism comes from the bottom. Have you ever heard conversations like developers complaining that those idiots in the marketing department, they sold products that we have not developed yet? Yeah? Raise your hand. 50%, 60%. Okay, so you know what I'm talking about. Now, these are sects, meaning that you are creating a group of people, developers, who think they are better or worse than another group of people. And this is sectarianism. Whenever you create groups who believe that they are better or worse than somebody else, that's sectarianism. And of course, you prevent cooperation in that case. What you obfuscate is the possibility for mutual understanding and collaboration and cooperation. Third one, I'm very sorry that, I mean, with the lights you cannot see the background. Anyway, the third one is what we call feudalism. Now, what is feudalism? Is when you have a landlord, historically, you have a landlord who will give the land to people so that they can tend to the land, and then they can pay taxes to the landlord, right? And then, of course, there are multiple levels of power between the workers and the landlord. So basically, it's a classical hierarchical structure in organizations. Now, the problem with this is that inevitably, you develop some kind of politics. Have you ever noticed that in organizations, the hierarchical structure is not the way people collaborate and communicate? Usually people communicate with each other and collaborate because for a number of different reasons. Because they root for the same football team, or because some kids go to the same school, or because these guys went to school together, went to the college together, or because they sleep together, okay, for a number of reasons. Okay. So the actual politics, the power and dynamics cannot be constrained within the organizational structure, but when you use just this feudalism to impose decisions and control by power, what you are obfuscating is the real decision-making process and stuff and stuff and stuff. So anyway, obfuscation of relationships. So far I've been talking about obfuscating information, obfuscating collaboration, obfuscating relationships, real relationships. So 3 forms of obfuscation. Then again, these will prevent you from changing and adapting faster. Let's move on. Another one. Sorry for the background. As you can see, there's a goat over there. And the other thing is what I like to call scapegoating. Now, scapegoating in some religion is a ritual. And basically, it's the ritual of taking a goat and then imposing on this goat all of your sins, or the sins of your community, and then leave the goat to die alone in the desert. Okay, so that's scapegoating. Okay, that's what it is. In organizations, scapegoating happens when you are made responsible for something, but you're not given the authority to decide anything. Like, oh, now you are responsible for that project. However, we have decided on the budget, on the staffing, on the deadlines, on the scope, and on the technology. Okay? However, you are responsible for making this happen, and you cannot decide anything. When you are given responsibility without authority, you are scapegoating somebody. Okay? So scapegoating is a way to obfuscate a real responsibility and accountability. And that happens a lot in organizations. I'm not asking you to raise your hands because I don't want to see the answer. Okay. Another one, passing the buck. Have you ever heard somebody, let's say that there's a problem, okay? You're doing something at work, you have a complicated process, maybe you have to deliver something, whatever, then you are late, or you have a problem, you have some kind of issue, and people start telling you, oh, well, I did my job. Ever happened to you to hear this sentence, I did my job? Okay, yep, 1, 2, or so many, too many, okay, stop. Sometimes the reality is too hard. That happens when you keep people in the blind. When people work and they do not know why they are working, they don't have any understanding of the impact of their work on other people. They have no idea of what happens before their work, what happens after their work. But you just give tasks to people and you tell them, okay, just do this. And they do it. And then when the overall process fails, the only thing they can say is, well, I did my job, right? Basically, you are obfuscating what we call organizational clarity. People need to have clarity on their work if you want them to be able to perform better. If you want to have smart people, you have to explain why we're doing something, not only what they need to do. Okay, that's what we call organizational clarity. I mean, there's much more, but that's the idea. Another one, the thing that you can barely see on the screen is a very nice machine, which is called the do-nothing machine. It's a very complicated piece of mechanical engineering which runs and does absolutely nothing useful. Okay. So the other form of obfuscation is overcomplicating. And have you ever worked with processes that are too much bureaucratic for what you really need? Yeah, 50%. Tools that are way too complicated for what you need to do? 40, 30%. Yes. Now, the problem with complicated things is that if you want to be adaptive, it means that you need to be able to respond quickly. You need to change quickly. Changing something complicated takes much longer and much more effort than changing something simple. So simplicity is the way in Agile to stay adaptive. You should strive for simplicity. It's one of the principles in the Agile Manifesto. So anytime you overcomplicate your processes, or anytime you overcomplicate the tools that you use, you are becoming less adaptive. You are slower in responding to change. You are obfuscating what we call here the real signal that you want to send, the real outcome that you want to obtain. Another one. I'm going to go fast because I have only 7 minutes left. Obfuscation number 7. And this is muddled communication. Another test. Have you ever been exchanging email with someone for a couple of days with no solution until you bumped into that person at the coffee machine and in 2 minutes you solved the problem? Ever happened? Yeah, to everyone basically, right? Now, the thing is, every time we use a communication media, which is not face-to-face communication, you reduce the bandwidth of information. Face-to-face communication is the highest bandwidth communication media that we have, because you can actually create rapport with that person. So anytime we use something like Zoom, Slack, email, WhatsApp, whatever you use, basically you are reducing your bandwidth in communication and you create more space for misunderstanding. Now, I'm very happy that we have Zoom, Slack, WhatsApp, and stuff, because it's not possible all the time to have a face-to-face conversation. However, every time you miss the opportunity for a face-to-face conversation and you opt for a less efficient media, then you are obfuscating rapport with that person. You are obfuscating the possibility to work together, collaborate, and think together. So just be careful about which kind of tools you use. I like this picture. So the guy is jiggling, a number of things on the railway tracks, and sooner or later we know there will be a train coming, right? Okay, but the guy is probably distracted, and so the other form of obfuscation is what I like to call fragmented attention. Another quick test: have you ever tried to get something done, and you get constantly interrupted by phone calls, Slack messages? People coming at your desk, emails and stuff. Okay. Do you think you can be effective and productive if if your attention is constantly interrupted and distributed among many things? Probably not, right? In my opinion, this kind of behavior in organizations is another echo of the Industrial Revolution. It comes from the 100% resource utilization mindset. Meaning that we have a tendency in organizations, as if people were machines, to utilize their time 100%. Any of you is at the moment working on more than one project and the total is more than 100% of your time? Raise your hand. Like people working on 2, 3 projects for like 60% of your time on one project and 50% on another one, plus all the extras? Yeah. Okay. Now, then again, we have to move away from this myth of 100% resource utilization when it comes to intellectual work, because the brain doesn't work like that. Okay. I need to go fast. Last one is simply what I like to call postcards from the past, which is basically when your feedback loops are so slow that you miss the opportunity to correlate cause and effect. What I'm saying is, if I go to this gentleman and I gently kick this gentleman here, okay, he might respond one way or another. So it would be very easy for me, very easy for me to correlate my cause with the effect, right? But if I kick this guy and then 1 week later I find a big scratch on my car, okay, it was you, but it's much harder to correlate cause and effect, right? Because I've forgotten a number of things in the meantime, there's a lot more information that comes in the meantime. So every time your feedback loops are too long and the information becomes meaningless, you obfuscate the opportunity to correlate cause with effect. So these 9 patterns, these 9 sources of obfuscation, they will make you slower and not so adaptive as you could be. Thing is, we tend usually not to talk about this. My recommendation, my suggestion for you is please do start talking about these things. In Agile, we do have this concept of running, for instance, retrospectives, right? So there are 2 things in Agile. One is inspect the process, inspect what we do and the outcome of what we do. But we should also remember that part of Agile is inspecting how we work together as a human system. And we tend to forget that. So my recommendation, my suggestion to you is just try to use this vocabulary: scapegoating, postcards from the past, model communication, sectarianism, and so on and so on and so on. Bring this vocabulary into your everyday use. I understand that these things sometimes are not easy to discuss. I also understand that sometimes there's not much you can do at your level, and you need to start talking about these things with somebody at some other level. I understand very well all that. However, I'd like to offer this vocabulary to you, because the moment you start giving a name to something, you can start talking about it and you can start to change it. Okay, and that's my point. There is one last piece of advice that I'd like to give you, which is this. If you want to try this, which you might, this is my last piece of unsolicited advice. And the reason why there's a winery there, this wine plantation, is very simple. Because and that's the reason also why there is growing in the title of this talk. You don't transform, you don't change a human system. You can grow a human system. And you cannot expect that what you do will yield the results that you would like, but still you try. It's more similar to growing something alive and biological like this plantation rather than a mechanical process. So if you want to do this, my last piece of recommendation is this one. Be kind. Be kind. And this is not like a touchy-feeling thing. It's something that I think is very relevant to what we do. The moment you start challenging people's assumptions, the moment you start challenging the metaphors by which people operate, the moment you start discussing things and habits that have been in place for 10 years, 20 years, 50 years, it works much better if you do that kindly, rather than trying to force it. You cannot force good wine to grow, sorry. You can create the conditions for that. And I'm done. So I hope you enjoyed the ride, and this is my contact information.